Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our fourth public debriefing about the outcomes of the last plenary meeting of BEREC. With me today is also the current incoming chair and next year's chairman of BEREC, Jeremy Gottfried. He will present the work program for 2019. And jumping into the agenda, we have a lot of reports to report about. The P4 was extremely productive in terms of output, and I can proudly say with this plenary we have completely finalized the work program for 2018. So, as you know, one of the focus areas for 2015 was 5G. What we wanted to do is to address all the challenges of 5G for a swift rollout of 5G in Europe, to be a world leader in this technology. And to start, we have 3 reports that are in close connection to 5G. So the first one I want to to present is the BEREC report on practices on spectrum authorization, award procedures and coverage obligations with a view to considering their suitability to 5G. So the report provides an overview, in particular on the auction regimes. As you can see in these charts, auctions are the most commonly reported award mechanisms in every band identified. So, and the second authorization regime is beauty contests. We have also seen in some countries and in some bands first come, first serve regimes, and once we have also a hybrid form, which is a mixture between beauty contest and first come, first serve principle. What we can say is that the first come, first serve method has been used in bands such as 1500, 2.3 or 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, but only in those cases where which have not been assigned for mobile services yet, and they were also used in earlier awards. What are now the design objectives of award procedures that we have identified? The most important objective was competition that was nominated by 80%. In 80% of award procedures, competition was one of the objectives pursued by competent authorities in order to secure competition in downstream markets as a means to promote consumer welfare. In 60% of the cases, we have also seen efficient use of spectrum, efficient assignment, and selection of operators that value spectrum the most. We have also seen in more than half of the cases coverage, connectivity, broadband penetration as one of the objectives of award procedure. Also innovation was, in particular in 4G and 5G awards, very often a design objective. When it comes to the auction format, the choice of the design very much depends on the fact if they are suitable to achieve or to reach these objectives. They also, the design for the auctions also depend very much on the market circumstances, in particular how much of spectrum is available, the number of participants, and demand patterns. For the design, also efficiency considerations play a very important role in terms of aggregation risks, and if a spectrum or parts of the spectrum are substitutable to each other. And also the risk of fragmenting spectrum was taken into consideration. What is very important and remarkable as a finding, that also under other objectives, high acceptance of the auction format by market participants plays a very important role. Under other objectives, we have also seen such objectives like adequate revenues from auctions, but we can clearly say that in a majority of member states, revenues are not an objective. In cases where we have seen beauty contests as a selection process, we've seen criteria like coverage in particular as one of the most important criteria to assess the bid, number of space station, financial bid, and also from a competition perspective, very interesting to see the commitment to provide MVNO access. So these are mainly the objectives we have seen and how they were pursued by member states. So I want to focus a little bit now on the competition issues that we have seen. As I said, competition concerns were very often mentioned and by the most of the respondents to be considered when designing award procedures. These concerns relate to, in particular, to extremely asymmetric spectrum holdings, foreclosure strategy towards smaller operators, and also to operators that are maybe less convergent in their strategy. There were also concerns about tacit collusion as well. So, and what are the measures to safeguard competition and to tackle these concerns? We see spectrum caps as the most prominent one. We see also reservation of spectrum for certain bidders or groups of bidders. But we also have to say that we see this only in a few cases. Others, such as wholesale access obligations, are used, but half of the respondents said that they do not consider any wholesale access obligation in their award procedures. And in order to facilitate market entry, band bundling also is one of the measures to safeguard competition in order to give access, in particular to new entrants, an appropriate set of bands. Let's have a look at the license durations, and you remember that in the code, the Electronic Communication Code foresees now that the regime on license duration should be 15 plus 5 years. So, and as you can see in the chart, this reflects only the reality or the status quo. We have seen 15 years as the most commonly reported license duration. The next one in exactly 39 cases of award procedures. The next one is 20 years, and we have also seen indefinite license duration. 4 competent authorities have used that in 21 award procedures. So what are the criteria taken into account when defining license duration? This is, of course, investment security and predictability. Also, to be flexible on the market condition. There is also taken into considerations the overall timetable for spectrum auctions and the synchronization with other license terms, and to reflect also technology cycles within the industry. When it comes now to coverage obligations, most of the competent authorities define a minimum quality of service and to have, for instance, to have minimum throughput or a minimum availability. And the rationale for all these coverage obligations is in particular to avoid spectrum hoarding. So this relates clearly to the minimum criteria applied, but it reflects also the characteristics of each country and the coverage situation in the member states. What has to be said that it was clearly mentioned by almost all NRAs that it is extremely important not to impose an unnecessary burden on the operators in order not to sterilize spectrum and to not overdue in coverage obligations, because this is really devaluating the spectrum as well. But on the other hand side, coverage obligations are used to avoid cherry picking of network rollout only in the most interesting and the most populated areas. So what can we say now with a view to 5G? Unfortunately, it's a little bit early to have very specific conclusions whether or not these terms and conditions are suitable for 5G. But what we have seen is that, and this is the opinion of the NRAs, that different bands, and you see the mix of bands that will be used for 5G, that these different bands will most likely or maybe require different authorization regimes. It might be the case that more innovative ways of authorizing spectrum may be necessary. This holds true on the one hand side for the innovation side of 5G, and on the other hand side as well for coverage obligations. So what we can say in terms of coverage obligations and targets for 5G, that it seems that the focus on covering roads and railways seem to increase. In several member states, NRAs or competent authorities are considering that or have already implemented that. Remote area obligations become more important, or specific locations obligations. We see a discussion on area coverage versus what we have seen mainly in the past, population coverage. We see enhanced mobile broadband targets, so meaning higher bandwidth, and also specific quality of service requirements in terms of, for instance, latency requirements and obligations. So as I said, it is a little bit too early for very specific conclusions, but we have identified certain trends that show that the award procedures, the coverage obligations, or the obligations in general combined with the award procedures are more sophisticated than in the past, more specified and more targeted to the needs in different member states. Well, that's it for this report on award procedures. We can then at the later stage after my presentation we can go into discussion on this report as well if you have any question. So the next report, or let's say the common position that will be out for public consultation, is the common position on mobile network infrastructure sharing. The public consultation will run until the 18th of January. And in principle, we will issue 3 common positions. So this is one part of this paper. We have also a legal framework analysis and a background chapter on infrastructure sharing, and we have also integrated an indicative analysis of different types of network sharing deals in our report. So the common position one that we have agreed upon is for the purpose of promoting a common understanding between NRAs on sharing. We have made definitions on certain expressions, because we have seen that if you talk about passive sharing, active sharing, or other sharing types, so the terminology is not always in a similar way used across Europe. So we decided to start as a starting point with a common position in defining the following or these three terms. The second common position is about the main objectives to be pursued when considering network sharing agreements. So this common position 2 includes the main objectives to be pursued, so which is effective competition, better connectivity, and efficient use of spectrum. And in particular, we seek input from stakeholders whether or not these are the right objectives to pursue in network sharing, when assessing network sharing agreements. So, and the common position 3 are the parameters to consider when assessing the network sharing agreements. We have identified 5 different parameters, which are the competitive market forces evolution, is market share, market shares, competitive forces, number of operators in play or involved in the sharing, the technologies involved, the geographic scope, the time frame, and so on. So there are, among these 5 headlines, there are a number of criteria to be, or parameters to be assessed. The next one is to achieve a feasible level of competition. This mainly relates to geography. So there might be areas where full infrastructure-based competition is reasonable. There might be other geographic areas where this is not that clear. And a third area is where reasonable level of competition is not feasible at all. And so in order to distinguish between these areas, the assessment and the parameters could be different when assessing network sharing deals. So also the type of sharing agreement has to be considered, from active sharing to passive sharing, and virtual access, and so on. So that the type of sharing has to be also considered when to make the assessment. From a competition point of view, also the level of information shared between the participants in a sharing deal is also of utmost importance when assessing the agreement. And what we have also considered is that the reversibility of the agreement is also one of the key components to assess. And in particular, the timing component of the agreement, whether it's of definite or indefinite term. So this has to be assessed as well. So, and we are seeking input now whether or not these are the right parameters, but not only whether these are the right parameters, but also how to assess these parameters. So, and as I said, the public consultation is now open until 18th of January, and we are really looking forward to your input because in particular in the context of 5G, we see network sharing as one of the major maybe drivers or even hurdles to a swift 5G rollout. So it is of utmost importance that we receive your input on what we have found as common positions. So what we have also adopted during the plenary is our common position on information to consumers on mobile coverage. I have already presented this in our debriefing in June, and we have, as far as it was possible, included the comments we received during the public consultation. I really want to thank you for your inputs, but I don't want to go into detail today on this topic. Okay, I think this was one of the most awaited output of BEREC this year. We have adopted an opinion for the evaluation of the net neutrality regulation and the BEREC net neutrality guidelines. Before our co-chairs from the expert working group for net neutrality will present the details, I want to give you a short overview about the objectives and the general conclusions we made. So the scope of the opinion was the regulation as well as the regulation itself and the BEREC net neutrality guidelines. The approach that we have taken was to collect input from stakeholders at a very early stage on the application, and we wanted to have input on the application of the guidelines. And we also collected input from the NRAs on the experiences they have or they had on the application of the guidelines. So I think this opinion comes at the right time because we see currently the first court decisions coming in on net neutrality decisions made by the national regulators, and they are all confirming so far the decisions taken by the regulators. So it is not surprising that one of the general conclusions was that the net neutrality rules work well from our perspective and fulfill the aim of protecting end-user rights and internet innovation. What we do not recommend and what we do not see for the foreseeable future, that there should be a review of the regulation. But nevertheless, we see room for improvement to clarify the guidelines in certain instances and in order to answer specific questions at the table. We will also pursue further consistency in the application of the regulation. So, and with a view to 5G, we think as BEREC that the regulation seems to leave considerable room for implementation of 5G technologies. So far, we have no indication that there are use cases or products out there in the market who would really be negatively impacted by the net neutrality rules currently in place. So having said that, I will give the word to our co-chairs, Frode and Michel.
Thank you, Johannes. A topic of particular interest regarding net neutrality regulation has been new technologies and 5G in particular. And the BEREC opinion concludes that the regulation seems to leave considerable room for implementation of 5G technologies, such as network slicing, 5G quality of service class identifiers, and mobile edge computing. And the opinion gives more details about these specific technologies. Furthermore, BEREC concludes that to date, BEREC has no knowledge of any concrete examples given by stakeholders where the implementation of 5G technology would be impeded by the regulation. We explicitly asked for such examples in the consultation, and none were given to us. BEREC also concludes that we will consider to further clarify in the guidelines different topics, and four areas has been foreseen for that. The first one is commercial practices, where we will pursue a step-by-step methodology for assessment of zero rating, and also by addressing some new variants of zero rating that has occurred in the market the last couple of years. Regarding traffic management, BEREC will look into the differentiation of quality of service for Internet access services, which has been requested by some stakeholders. We will also look into data compression, blocking of content, legitimate security issues, and the duration of traffic management measures. Regarding specialized services, we will look into the definition of specialized services, the relationship between specialized services and Internet access services, and the impact of specialized services on the general quality of Internet access services. And finally, regarding transparency, BEREC will look into the scope of the transparency requirements, mobile Internet access service speed, hybrid Internet access services, and the process of certification.
Yeah, there it goes. So for me, 2 points remain to add. In addition to looking at the rules in which, no, let me phrase differently. The regulation focuses at the behavior of ISPs that provide Internet access services, and we find that this is the right scope. So we don't intend to question this scope as BEREC, but we did note that further up or down, depending on how you see that, further up the value chain of the internet, certain technologies or platforms have the ability to function as a bottleneck. At least we think that's possible in theory. One example we mentioned in the report is the app stores for mobile phones. So once again, these two, in our view, do not fall under the scope of the regulation. But in theory, it's possible that these platforms are managed in a way that affects, with an A in English, so that can deter the openness of the internet. So we think this is a subject that should be kept under scrutiny at European level. While again, we don't think that this should be necessarily done in the context of the net neutrality regulation as we know it. And second point is an outlook to what BEREC will do in next year, which is, as mentioned before, we will clarify the guidelines. So we will seek to make certain points more clear or even more clear. And we'll start right next month with that. And we will get back to you with a written consultation in October, where we will present updated texts. And then we expect, of course, your input, and we will process the consultation. And we aim to present the new version of the guidelines early 2020. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let me also thank all the stakeholders who were engaged in discussions with us on this extremely important topic. What has not been mentioned so far today on net neutrality is that, of course, BEREC is continuing to exchange on concrete net neutrality cases during the plenary. So I think we had 4 cases being discussed during our last plenary. So in order to ensure a consistent application of the net neutrality rules throughout Europe. And as far as we can see, we have managed quite well so far that we see a consistent application of the rules across Europe. So then let's move on to the next point. We will publish a report for public consultation on terminating contracts and switching of providers. So the public consultation will be open until the 23rd of January. So this report falls under our strategic priority 5 in our midterm strategy, which is called Exploring New Ways to Boost Consumer Empowerment. And we think that this work is essential to safeguard competition throughout increasing consumer choice. Due to the consolidation wave that is going on already for many years now in Europe and the reduced choice consumers have in terms of market participants, we think that safeguarding competition and consumer choice is essentially for the future. So the goal of the report is to better inform both consumers and NRAs on how they might maintain, enhance consumer awareness of their ability to exercise choice. And we have made an analysis for different types of electronic communication services, including fixed and mobile services, fixed and mobile broadband, OTT service, broadcasting, pay TV, different forms of bundles, which become ever more important. And my colleague Tom Boyce will now present the details of this report.
Thanks, Johannes. Yes, as Johannes set out, the report is to look at the various practices on across member states related to terminating contracts and switching a provider. The report is divided into 3 discrete parts that are represented by these pillars on the screen. The first pillar, it reflects the responses we got from NRAs when we asked them a number of questions about the processes they have, the processes that operate in their member state to facilitate switching of provider and provide safeguards to consumer during that switching process. So the types of questions we asked is which party does the end user or the consumer need to contact in order to initiate a switch of provider? What must customers do to cancel their contract with the transferring provider? Is there a regulated customer validation process? And what I mean by that is that a process by which the customer and the customer's request to switch provider may be validated, perhaps by someone other than the transferring provider or the receiving provider. And we ask questions about how long does the porting process take, and if there is a legally defined maximum length of time for the switching process. And what we mean by the switching process is the date indicated in the user's agreement to enter the service with the new provider and the time that that new service becomes active. That's the first section. The second section report then is we asked NRAs, having regard for the processes that might just happen to take place, is there any rules or regulations in place to facilitate, so to underpin some of the processes that are there? And the aim is to provide a high-level summary analysis of the different practices and decisions or legal requirements which apply in member states to considering discrete aspects. In particular, we looked at the switching process itself, contract matters, contract termination, charges and fees, customer retention, and technical issues and compensation. And what I mean by, for example, rules related to contract matters, these would include rules such as the maximum length of a contract period, the maximum or minimum length of a notice period if a customer wants to switch. Any rules or regulations in respect of rollover contracts or contract change notifications or unfair terms and conditions in contracts. So the results and the input from NRAs on those types of questions have been are consolidated in section 3 of the report. The final section of the report then is a bit more open. Sorry, I just have to get into my own machine. Is a bit more open. What we did was we identified, or we tried to identify what were the biggest factors that might inhibit customers from switching ECS providers. So we identified a non-exhaustive list of 19 separate factors which might inhibit switching, and NRAs were asked to indicate the 4 most significant issues, which in their experience represent the biggest obstacle, but it is the biggest obstacle with respect to each of the various types of ECS. So, for example, a factor that might be a big inhibitor for switching of a mobile may not be the same, may not be a consideration at all for if you're switching a fixed broadband service, for example. So represented on the slide there is the kind of high-level results of the responses that we received. For example, on fixed number-based ICS, contractual obstacles. Now, what we mean by contractual obstacles, that incorporates things like the contract length, the long minimum contract periods, penalties for early termination of contract, use of rollover contracts, requirement to return free or discounted equipment, perhaps even outstanding debt owed to the transferring provider, which would prevent a switch. When I talk then about, you see, under mobile actions by the transferring provider, this would include actions such as the retention or save practices that the transferring provider might have, win-back practices just immediately after the switching process, perhaps not providing the customer with the authentication code needed to activate a switch in a timely manner, and or perhaps including something like a very prescriptive method by which the customer must cancel their contract. For example, looking for a hard copy in writing with an original signature. When it comes to fixed IAS, one of the big factors is the patently obvious. I don't switch my fixed IAS because there is no alternative. I am getting the best service that is available. So the absence of an alternative offer or a alternative technology, I can't switch to cable because it's not available in my area, is a big factor. And so on down to the various types of or categories of ECS. Just to say that when we were designing the questionnaire and discussing with our colleagues around, we came up with what we thought was we tried to get a common definition of what is a bundle, but there was a few NRAs had defined bundles slightly differently, so we've incorporated both. So when we say defined bundles, we provide in the report in a glossary at the back what we mean by defined bundle, but we also provide the results for those few NRAs that define bundles differently. So as Johannes said, the report is going for public consultation until the 23rd. And I'm just getting into it because we have a number of questions that we want to ask stakeholders. One, obviously, we provide the opportunity to comment on what we have done, but we're open to suggestions if there's any processes or rules for bundles that might help address the issues we've identified, and any barriers that we haven't considered, and we'd be happy to get any input, any relevant input on that as well.
Thank you very much, Tom, and we are all looking forward to all the comments and input you can provide. So, and having accomplished the work program of 2019, it's time to start working on next year's program, which will be mostly defined by the work that is foreseen to BEREC in the code, but my successor, Jeremy Godfrey, will inform you about the details. Jeremy, please.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of you will have been here at the last debrief and will have read the consultation document on the work programme, or will have heard me talk about it on many occasions in the last few months. Sometimes I felt I must be boring people because I'd given the presentation so often. So what I'll do today really is talk mostly about the feedback that we had on the draft work programme and how we've responded to that. And then I'll finish with just a little bit of a reminder about the overall shape of the work programme. And just a reminder of the process. So we started 9 months ago gathering inputs, trying to keep track of what was in the code as it evolved. Went through an outline, a draft that we consulted on. We've had the feedback, and now today we're publishing the final work programme. In terms of what we heard back from responses, we had 18 responses. I think they were generally supportive. I think everyone acknowledged the major role the code was going to play in BEREC's work next year and into 2020. We heard quite a lot about engagement with BEREC, which is something, of course, we discussed at the BEREC Stakeholder Forum in October. And as well as the traditional public consultations, it seems there's a lot of appetite for earlier input, particularly into the guidelines projects. So we have asked each of the working groups working on a guidelines project to consider some form of early input. Sometimes that will be a workshop, sometimes it might be a more formal call for written inputs. That will be something that the working groups will decide based on how much we already know and on the particular characteristics of each project. The other thing that I think we'd heard and we've maintained is that, of course, it's a lot of work for BEREC to do all the guidelines, but it means it's also a lot of work for stakeholders in responding to consultations on the guidelines. So by and large, we've tried to schedule work so that if we publish a consultation, we aim to make a final guidelines not at the next plenary but at the one following that, and that will enable us to give a little bit of extra time to stakeholders to respond, and it gives us a bit of extra time to consider the responses as well. We had a small number of additional work streams proposed. Given the really the capacity of BEREC to do work and the heavy demand of the code, we didn't feel that we had capacity to accommodate those in 2019, but we are moving in BEREC towards a more multi-annual planning, and in particular we'll be publishing in January an outline work programme for 2020. It'll be a high-level outline, and so those additional work streams proposed by stakeholders we will take as early suggestions for the 2020 work programme and beyond. And then today, of course, we'll be publishing it. There are two things I'd like to draw people's attention to as kind of changes that I think are significant. One is that we've added an extra deliverable to the kind of we had a project on looking at some of the longer term implications of 5G, and we decided that what would be quite useful would be to examine both the benefits and the practicalities of providing coverage information and capability information on a pan-European basis. So there was a suggestion that people, I don't know whether they call it upstream or downstream, but people in the ecosystem who are maybe wanting to develop pan-European industrial IoT applications, for example, would find it very useful for their planning purposes to know what was available in which country, and to have that in a consistent way, so they don't have to go to 28 different coverage maps, which all have different types of information. So to understand what would be the best way of providing that information, would it really be of value? And if it is of value, what information would need to be provided? So that's as I say, that's a feasibility study, and following that feasibility study, if it seems that it's a good idea to do that, then there'll be further projects in later years to work out how to bring that to fruition. The other thing to talk about is the very first set of guidelines, which are on intra-EU communications. And I think at the last debrief, somebody asked me whether that was going to be focusing purely on the narrow question of derogations, which is what so in the code, BEREC is required to do guidelines on the derogation from it. And somebody had asked, were we planning to look beyond just the narrow question of derogations? And I think we also, so in the feedback on the consultation, we saw that again there was appetite for further clarification on the implementation of those intra-EU call guidelines. And so the expert working group that's responsible for that already has a list of more issues that can be included in those guidelines that would be useful, and that will in fact be taken forward with a workshop in January. I think January the 29th is planned. So I'm going to, on this one, because of the very tight time frame, everything I said about giving stakeholders a long time to respond, unfortunately, is not practical. I mean, I wish we were in a different situation, but we have to play the hand that we're dealt here. So because we need those guidelines to be in place in time, before the regulation comes into place, the way we intend to engage with stakeholders will be through that workshop, and at that workshop we'll be able to engage both with early thoughts on some of the issues that have been identified, but also to hear from stakeholders if there are other issues that need to be included in those guidelines. And then just a really quick run through the overall shape. I think there are three aspects to the work programme for next year. The first of them is harmonising implementation, mostly of the code, but also of some other aspects of the whole telecoms package. So as well as guidelines that you see on that, there's also the net neutrality guidelines, which are not code related, but obviously are a very significant piece of work. But we've already talked about those. Thanks. Again, there was support for BEREC not just focusing on the guidelines, but I think BEREC's role as technical experts contributing to the conversation about the future. So the study on the dynamics of investment in very high capacity network connectivity is an attempt to take a slightly different approach to understanding all the different perspectives and working out how they fit together in order to maybe bring some more insight into are there feedback loops in the dynamics, what are the regulatory levers that might have the greatest impact. There's the 5G, which I already talked about, the additional deliverable, but we see this report is kind of a pathfinder report to ask, apart from all the work we've done this year, which a lot of that's been focused on spectrum issues, making sure that the investors have the capability to invest in 5G. This is more looking at the broader 5G ecosystem and the IoT ecosystem. What other regulatory aspects are there which could either inhibit or facilitate innovation in that ecosystem, and which regulators and maybe policymakers will need to give attention to in the years ahead. And there's a flip side of that, which is also in terms of the core business of regulators, say looking at wholesale broadband markets, in what way might the deployment of 5G start to influence the way that core business is done? End users are, of course, what regulation is all about. It's all for the benefit of end users. So again, we're planning a workshop with various stakeholders on what might a vision be for the digital single market in telecoms. What should that deliver for end users? And that will be something which will probably feed into BEREC's medium-term strategy work that will be done in 2020. And finally, there's the data economy report, which is something we're consulting on at the moment, and which we will be finishing off next year. Thanks. And lastly, I want to talk just about stakeholder collaboration. So I talked quite a lot about how we are very keen to engage more effectively and more extensively with the industry stakeholders. But I think it's also important for us to engage with other sets of stakeholders. So particularly within the EU, and as the data economy develops, BEREC has a role to play in contributing our expertise to discussions on wider digital issues involving the Commission, the RSPG, ENISA, data protection network, and so forth. So we're keen to maintain those connections and contribute. And then on international, as well as working with colleagues in the regulatory community around the world, we're particularly keen to support the work on the Western Balkans initiative, where the 6 countries and economies from the Western Balkans that are on the accession track, one small corner maybe of the accession process is approximating the telecommunications and the regime, and so for us to be working with the Western Balkans on capacity building and also on facilitating some of the arrangements between themselves in preparation for them joining the EU in due course it will be a particular area of focus for us next year. And so the next steps on the work programme, we publish it today. By the end of, that's the 2019 work programme, we'll have a draft outline of the 2020 work programme to be published at the end of January. That will include, a lot of it will be based on things we already know about because we're starting them in 2019, but they'll finish in 2020. There's obviously a lot of things we do every year, and then there's the BEREC strategy for 2020. And then we've also got a number of other, I would say, more tentative ideas, which we're not yet committed to, but which will be considered. And then the whole work planning process will kick off again. So tentatively, April next year, we'll be again seeking your early inputs into what we might put into the work programme for 2020. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Congratulations for putting together such a work program with the support, of course, of all the stakeholders. And I wish you all the best for accomplishing the work program in 2019. So let me touch now upon a few other outcomes of the last plenary. So, and what I wanted to mention is so that the basic work of BEREC is done by our expert working groups, and following a workshop we had at the margins of plenary 3 in October, we have made a reorganization of our expert working group structure. So we have, to a certain extent, some groups have remained the same, some have been renamed, some have been merged, and some have been separated. So what I wanted to highlight here is our 2 groups. You can see on the left-hand side a group called Open Internet. This is what you know as the Net Neutrality Expert Working Group, but we decided to rename this group in order to signal a broader scope of what we are doing on net neutrality. We will, in the future, not limit ourselves to simple network neutrality, but to look at the broader landscape and ecosystem of the open internet, as you have seen in our opinion on the evaluation of the guidelines and the BEREC regulation, where we have made some statements of neutrality in the overall internet ecosystem. So this is a clear signal that we do not limit ourselves to only network neutrality. The second expert working group I wanted to mention is the expert working group on planning and future trends. This is a new expert working group which is dedicated to looking into more longer-term issues of the competitive environment, about technological developments, looking at the horizon, I would say, and beyond of what is now currently on the table. So this will be a more forward-looking expert working group, also working maybe on the midterm strategy, on the work. They will have a role in developing the work program. But as I said, they will look at the more longer-term strategic perspectives of BEREC and the work of BEREC. So what can be said to this new expert working group structure, for which we have appointed the new co-chairs? we have now co-chairs from 14 instead of 12 national regulatory authorities. So we broadened the participation of the NRAs. And what is from a gender perspective extremely what I'm extremely glad to say is that we increased gender balance from 26% female participation to 45% female participation. It was not done by purpose, but it happened because we have extremely good female experts as well within BEREC. And this is a very fortunate situation for BEREC and the NRAs. So we also elected the vice chairs for 2019 and the BEREC chair for 2020, who will be Dan Sjöblom from PTS, who will chair BEREC in 2020. And the additional vice chairs for 2019 will be Tanja Mucha from AKOS, Slovenia, Konstantinos Marcellos from Greece, from EETT, and Marcin Cici from UK, Poland. So this will be the team, as you can see, for next year, who will work on the work program and will be working together with you. So this is now coming slowly to the end. The overview on public consultations we will have out. You can see 2 public consultations open until 18th of January, which will be the BEREC Common Position on Infrastructure Sharing and the BEREC Report on Access to Physical Infrastructure in Market Analysis. And open until 23rd of January will be the BEREC Report on Termination of Contracts and Switching of Providers, and the BEREC report on a set of indicators to measure the Internet of Things. As we have adopted a lot of reports, we wanted to add in this presentation a comprehensive list of all the documents published, so that you have it on one spot. The presentation will be published on the BEREC website now. So, and coming to the end of this public debriefing and also of my chairmanship for BEREC in 2018, I just want to give you a short wrap-up of what we have done and what we have achieved during this year. As you remember, I wanted to focus on 3 areas which were 5G and tackling the 5G challenges ahead, harmonization and promoting the single market, and enhanced engagement with stakeholders. And we can proudly say that we have accomplished and delivered 100% of the work program that we had on the table. In this respect, I really want to thank all of you for the input, for the critical questions, for the discussions we had on the work program, on the specific reports. I want to thank the BEREC co-chairs and expert working groups for the excellent work done on accomplishing the work program. So we have issued a number of reports on 5G topics, now on spectrum authorization, infrastructure sharing, and the information to consumers on mobile coverage. We have also tackled the questions of net neutrality and 5G, which we have presented today. We have tried to promote the single market by further exchanging on the net neutrality cases on the table. We have also issued an opinion on a request to provide wholesale roaming access as an input for a decision by German Bundesnetzagentur. And as a contribution to harmonization as well, we have published now a report on indicators for IoT to make IoT development in Europe more comparable, and for data collection purposes create a common set of indicators and definitions in order to make member states comparable. And finally, the engagement with the stakeholders. We had 11 public consultations, which was an all-time high in BEREC, including 2-step public consultations where we seeked your input at a very, very early stage, and we gave you the opportunity to comment on the later stage as well. So, and we have also made a step into a more open BEREC by finalizing our open data policy, and I think as of mid-year or so, we have started to publish all the data we have collected and that can be published in Excel and CSV files in order to make it more accessible for you. So what's next? As already mentioned by Jeremy, we will have a workshop on intra-EU communication on the 29th of January here in Brussels. The information about it will be on the BEREC website, including a link for registration and an email address to provide input in advance of the workshop. Due to the tight time schedule we have on this report we have to deliver, we made the decision to make a workshop instead of a public consultation. But I think this workshop can be very useful to have a very interactive debate on the topic. The next plenary will take place in Budapest at the beginning of March, and a few days later, on the 13th of March, we will have the next public debriefing. And as a save the date, we will have a joint BEREC IIC conference on the 25th and 26th of June in Riga under the title Competing Continents, the Pursuit of Excellence in Electronic Communication. The purpose of this conference is to look at the question whether Europe is lagging behind or is heading towards the future and leaving all the other continents behind. Let's see, we will have a list of international speakers and the panel discussions where we want to look for answers who is doing best in competing between the big blocks in the world. So I would be very happy to welcome you at this occasion in Riga. So that's it from my side, and now we are open for discussion and for your question, and we will also take questions via Twitter. Thank you very much. So we have a question from Hector via Twitter. So the question is, BEREC finds that 80% of spectrum auctions aim to promote competition. What's with the remaining 20%? Maybe, Blaise, you can provide an answer to that.
There we go. Yes, thank you, Johannes, and thank you for the question. What we mean by 80% is pretty much that in 80% of the awards that have been considered in the report, the competition was one of the main objectives. For the 20 others, where competition was not considered as a main objective of the award, there are other objectives that can have been considered. Among with, we've got efficiency, or coverage, or innovation, or combination of those. So it's pretty much when the competent authority is considering an award, is looking at what are the main objectives of the award. In 80% of the cases, competition is part of it, and in 20% it is not. It has not been.
Thank you very much, Blaise. Any other question? Okay, let's finalize. Oliver, please.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Well, thanks for responding to the tweet. I guess I'll stick with your report on spectrum auctions or awards for the time being. So the first thing, a more general thing on the 5G priority topic, which we talked about at the last debrief, was the interaction or the collaboration between BEREC and RSPG going forward. And back in October, you announced that that was a topic that you would be considering before Christmas still. And I wanted to ask you whether you had something to report back on that, what has happened in the interim. Now on Blaise, this very useful elucidation of what other objectives might be pursued. I mean, has the expert working group in drawing up this report actually reflected upon the fact that competition is the only regulatory objective under the framework, and it would stand to be reasoned that any award procedure should therefore actually promote that objective? And then I have a couple of empirical questions still. So you said that there was, in the context of beauty contests, now a tendency for actually specific quality requirements to appear. And you mentioned latency requirements, and I was wondering what you have observed with regard to that specifically, and to what extent the expert working group considers this as potentially contradictory to the objective of service neutrality under the current framework. And then thirdly, I just wanted to hear you on whether you could give us an overview, an impression of whether, as part of the report, you find a tendency towards more multi-band auction or single-band auction designs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. I start with answering the question on the RSPG cooperation. So, given the provisions in the code on the peer review that will be chaired by RSPG in participation of BEREC, we have had in the meantime several contacts with RSPG, and I think we found a lot of common ground how to proceed with the peer review forum. We both think that the best way would be that the experts of the national regulatory authorities or / competent authorities who perform the award procedures should sit at the table and discuss in a very open format the specific auctions that are on the table. This is I think the most important point. We will come up, or we agreed to have a memorandum of understanding to lay out the common understanding of how the peer review should look like and the principles we want to have as a basis for this peer review. I think we had a common ground also on that we always supported that it should be a voluntary exercise in order to avoid a formal process comparable to a Article 7.7a proceeding where there is a formal opinion that you have to take in utmost account, and where you run the risk, if you're not taking it in utmost account, maybe even for good reasons, you face the risk of a challenge in court. So in order to secure a very open discussion of the experts, we want to frame the peer review in such a form to learn from each other. It's a learning exercise and it's a sharing of best practices in order, and that's what I said to RSPG on the stakeholder briefing on Monday, in order to promote harmonization in award procedures in Europe. So, and for the rest of the questions, maybe I'll hand over to Blaise.
Yes, thank you. Hope I didn't miss any, but first of all, coming back to the competition objective, when we say that for some of the award, competition was not considered as a main objective. I do believe that it's always considered when a competent authority is looking at an award, what the status for competition, but you may seem that for such award, the main objectives may not be on competition, but more on coverage, for example. It doesn't mean that competition is not in the head of the competent authority when it's designing the award. The second question I noted was regarding latency, and would that be in contradiction to service neutrality, or I would say maybe technology neutrality? This has not been considered as such in the report. Still, regarding technology neutrality, we see that competent authorities are really taking that into account, that the award should be a principle for, should have as principle technology and service neutrality. But that doesn't stop from having any requirements with regard to innovation and to promote some objectives with regard to latency or with regard to broadband throughput. But as I say, the connection between one latency and service and technology neutrality is not specifically discussed in the report. Finally, looking at multi-band bundling bands in the awards, in the report we're really looking at what are the reasons that are put forward by competent authorities or NRA when they are bundling several bands in a single awards. We haven't been looking at what is the trend. If there is a specific movement towards more bundling or less bundling. That has not been looked at, but in the report you really have the reasons that are considered by the competent authorities when they are bundling or when they not to bundle bands together.
Thank you very much, Blaise. Answers this question? Okay, thank you. Any other question? Yeah, please.
Is this better? My name is Wouter Gekieren from the European Broadcasting Union. Thanks so much for clarifying and for all the work you've been doing over the past few months. I had a small question on the process on net neutrality. We've taken note of the intention to launch a public consultation October next year. Is there anything we can already learn from you on whether there's a role for us and how that would evolve before October in the lead up to that work, or anything you could share with us would be welcome.
No, thank you very much for this question. I mean, as we are an open organization, you can approach us anytime if you have any specific input or if you think that we are missing something. So please feel free to contact us. We are constantly discussing net neutrality cases and so on, so please feel free to contact us. What we have mentioned here is only, I would say, the official timing of the process, so please feel free to contact us. Any other question? No, not Oliver. Please.
Good afternoon, Henk Mannekens from BT. You also opened for consultation a report on the access to physical infrastructure in market analysis. Is it possible to give some summary, well, some insight into what is covered in the report and what will be the next steps and the context?
Unfortunately, to go into detail, we have not. We don't have the experts here, but the report will be out this afternoon, so you can contact us anytime on that if you like. Oliver?
Okay, thank you. I'll this time it's more a mixed bag of tricks in terms of question content. So we noted that that the plenary actually also had a point of discussion at its meeting dealing with the Dutch wholesale fixed access case. And we would be curious to know what the nature of the discussion was and what, if any, information you can share with us about that discussion? That would be the first question. Secondly, there is, of course, the investment in very high capacity network study, which we discussed to some extent at the last debrief. And I just wanted to ask for an update on where the awards process on that is at this point. As per recollection, the submissions were due at the beginning of last month. And thirdly, you presented to us the new expert working group structure today. I was wondering whether you could first of all say something about those posts or positions held by representatives of the Office of Communications today, which may be leaving the European Union in not such a long time, and we are aware that some of these posts are held by them. So we would want to know whether there are some transition measures already in place.
Okay. Okay.
To close out on the expert working groups, we understand from what you've presented that the mobile and roaming working group has now been split up. And I wanted to ask you to specify to what extent the term mobile network evolution covers all of the topics that previously were dealt with by the mobile group, or whether there is a different scoping foreseen for that group. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice set of questions. On the study on the very high capacity networks, I will hand over to Jeremy later. Maybe on the Dutch case, what we have done during the plenary was to be informed by our Dutch colleague about the specific case, the rationale behind the decision, and the status of the proceeding. So there was little discussion, but only an information in order to better understand what were the rationale behind the decision on the Dutch case. On the new expert working groups and Ofcom participation, unfortunately, under the impression of Brexit, we have received no application for a co-chair position by Ofcom. There was one Ofcom co-chair in the past, but unfortunately there were, for obvious reasons, no applications, because in case of Brexit this would have put us in an awkward situation, and in order to secure the continuity of work, there was no application. Let me add that this is a very unfortunate situation for BEREC, given let me say, the role model Ofcom had in many aspects in the years in the past. But as long as it's possible, there will be Ofcom participation within BEREC, and even afterwards, I think we will always take a close look on what's going on in the UK. So, and on the split of mobile and roaming working group, we saw that in practice these two aspects of the same working group were already quite split. So we thought that it would be wise to split it, and that we have one focus on the mobile aspects and one on roaming. There are sufficient tasks to do for two expert working groups. And when it comes to the title, we wanted to give it a more future-looking title, number one, and number two, for the time being, we do not consider any major shift in what the expert working group is doing. And for the high capacity network study, Jeremy, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So the high capacity network study, as you know, was out to tender. We received a number of proposals, probably the perfect number of proposals, not too many, not too few. So we were able to evaluate them and we had a good choice of strong proposals. A preferred contractor has been identified and informed, and the other contractors have also been informed. And Lazo will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're still just in the standstill period at the moment before we proceed with the procurement. And then at the last plenary, we made all the kind of technical decisions necessary, financing decisions and so forth, to enable that to go ahead. Lazo, I don't know if there's anything you want to add, or is that's complete, is it? Okay, that's complete and accurate. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any other question? Okay, then what remains to say is to say thank you very much to all of you, to all the stakeholders for the support, the discussions, the critical questions and the exchange we had over the year 2018. We are glad to have accomplished our work program for 2018. I'm personally quite exhausted after this year, and I'm looking forward to the Christmas holidays. I wish you all the best for 2019, in particular, Jeremy. All the best for the delivering the work program and chairing BEREC. And to all of you, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. See you next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.